So welcome everybody to O3D Comic with the Metaverse track. We're talking about 3D assets and objects in the Metaverse. And these are really super important because it's going to be really, really hard if everybody has their own flavor of style and thing and object and it doesn't translate, and it's going to be a complete nightmare if we don't get these things at least standardized in a model that can do interoperability. So, let's talk about the experience. What is an experience? Kind of that centralized hub where people can come together and see all of these things and kind of the experience of who we are. I mean, we're doing it now in the real world. Let's flip to digital, right? But we use cloth. We have skin. We use things that are kind of common things that we know what they are in the real world. And in the digital world, it's not all the same, especially how we get them put together and represented. And then, where might these experiences happen? Everybody thinks, oh, well, I got to put my headset on and that's the only place it's going to happen. But that's not the truth, is that you're going to see it on your handheld. What you hold in your hand, your phone. Augmented reality. There's the first one where the largest penetration of devices are. You may see it in VR. You may see it on PC screens. You'll see a hybrid, all of them. But you have to understand that these are really important to differentiate where it will be. Because if you just focus in one area, you're not addressing the problem. And so, the other part here, like I said, LED screens, holodecks, multi-projector rooms, when people start wanting to do that, it's not far-fetched. I mean, who of you have gone to like a Van Gogh thing where they have all the video projectors all throughout the place and you're seeing this, you're walking amongst that experience. Do you really think that's far-fetched for somebody to build a metaverse room like that? Right, it's pretty easy to do. And then, of course, how you'll see it, first person, third person, top down, different ways of experiencing it or different ways that we're going to deal with this. But the other thing is that you have to have that kind of visual consistency. So you have to have the standard interoperability for 3D meshes, that chicken wire that builds what the object's going to be, the textures, what I paint and wrap on top of it, the runtime formats. When I say runtime formats, this means that the textures that you put into it have to come out so they work with the devices correctly. Okay? The graphics, the GPUs, they work differently on PCs than they do on phones. They come in different formats and flavors. So you've got to consider that as well, unless you want everybody to have a molten rock sitting in their hand when they're trying to get on the metaverse called their phone, because you're going to try and do all this stuff at runtime. So you've got to think about what are the things I can do to standardize between those. Lighting. Lighting's really important. We actually have to have that. Well, what does it look like when I light it on a mobile, when I light it on a tablet, when I light it in a projector room? How do I have this kind of consistency where at least I can give you a clue that these things should be like that? Animation, shaders, scenes, right? The layout of this room. Take a look. Desk is located there. I can measure 6 feet, 10 feet. I know the desk is placed there. In a 3D world, it is X coordinate 6, Y coordinate 10, Z coordinate 0. Same idea. That scene has to be made up of where I will place things. So how do I translate that when I go from Facebook's scene to Microsoft's scene to Google's scene to, Joe's scene? You need some kind of standardization to at least allow these things, or everybody has to have their own flavor of application that you're going to have to download or pull a module down or something like that. Okay, there's just no commonality. And if you ever want to see from one experience to the other, good luck on that, because now I have to have multiple systems trying to interpret what a scene looks like. So you'll always be breaking immersion between them. The other part of it is, if you look at what we have today, we have all these formats: OBJ, FBX, GLTF, USD, Alembic, Collada, texture formats. These are all the things that we deal with today. Some of you know what a JPEG is, or a PNG, and EXR. All of these things are part of it, and we use these as kind of our input formats, right? Are you really expecting that every single experience has got to know every single one of these things? I mean, you do have to come to a certain point of what makes it easier. You can't transmit all of these different types of formats over and over and over, even if you're trying to create a point of commonality. And then the funny thing is, the first two I'm talking about were input. The output side of this thing was the platform. That DDS, that PVR, your phone, ATSC, BC6, this is what it gets compiled down to that actually you see on your phone. You don't see a PNG, you don't see a JPEG, you see these output texture formats is what you see. Well, think of the bandwidth of me sending the original work of art before it's been processed to be used on your phone down to you. Or Can I just simply make you aware that, hi, I'm a mobile phone made by Samsung. Can you send me the compressed format of BC6 because that's what I actually prefer to use? And cut all that bandwidth and all of that out of the network. A couple things that can be made, those kind of decisions ahead of time. So, and then the other thing is, what does it actually look like? We've seen graphics from 2000, 2000s, 2010, 2020. We have physical-based materials, and they're different. The color of this desk, or this podium here, all right? Brown, wood color, that's our diffuse. But when light hits it, it reflects differently. Is it metallic? Is it shiny? Does it displace or diffuse light? These all are separate images that have to be passed down to build what that experience looks like. Some need it, some don't. Minecraft? Probably not. Call of Duty? Probably so. So you've got to look at how are these coming into play, and how do we at least create or come to a consensus of awareness so that an experience can use some of these things? Because when I have an avatar, and my avatar has bright linen, leather pants, steel earrings, and I walk into another environment, how does that other environment know that that was made of steel, or that it should shine or reflect, or it should look like leather? So your experience will be drastically different if there's no common standard interchange of information of awareness. And this is really important across the board. The other thing is we have a thing called LODs. For these who aren't technical, it's really simple. We start out with this incredibly high resolution detailed image of wood. But if I tell you to walk 3 feet away from it, you can't see the grain that well. So we make an LOD, we kind of divide it by 2, make a smaller image, and it looks right. And you get further away even more and more. If I was like a half mile away, do I really need that incredibly detailed picture of wood? Probably not, because you couldn't even see that it was wood. But you know it's brown, and it kind of does that thing. So we reduce them down. These are important because this is how we actually allow things to load and to operate in large scenes. This is how we actually make these things happen. And then, of course, how we do lighting, in the environments. We have different shader models that we do. These are things that are done in engines every day, okay? But there's no real standard behind them. Everybody has their flavor of what they're doing. And so if you plan on having this kind of cohesive, immersive experience, that's not going to happen until we at least try to come down to a handful of standards that can at least query and be aware of what we're trying to do. And so that's where I'm going with this. So let's talk about scenes. Remember I talked about this room, 6 foot by 10 foot, coordinate space, the layout. So if you're going from experience to experience, you've got to know where are the desks placed, okay? And in the 3D world, a desk is not a solid object, okay? I can literally walk through it like we've seen done for years and years. But if I put a collider on it, a physics collider, which is an invisible box that fits around it, and I hit that collider, I hit it. An impact occurs. We've got to define what that's got to be. I've got to have a standard way of defining that. And building prefabs, we call it a desk. Technically, it's a plank of wood with some metal beams with a bunch of screws and nuts and all those things. That's a prefab, is what it is. Defining those things so that if somebody wants to change these desks and use it in another experience, I can just change one piece of the prefab. I can say it's no longer a tan desk, it is now a black desk. Did I change the desk? No, same prefab, just modified it by changing an attribute in it. These are important because it's how we make unique environments. You don't really think in that video game that the shield that you have was 10 different wireframes of the shield, do you? No, they just painted a different texture on it like 10 different times and called it something cool. We do it all the time. It's standard fare. The standard of how we do it, however, is not fair because it's not there. Volumes, lights, scripted code. I mean, we all use the internet today, right? The funny thing about the internet is that you fire it up and you get that great interactive page. What you didn't realize is you loaded like 16 scripts and code in the background that actually happened that made it interactive, all right? Same thing in this kind of environment. If you have something that should have a reaction or should act a certain way, in other words, I have a necklace, and when I walk, my necklace should slide or move freely. Well, what is the weight of it? How does that work? Do I have some code that I want to do the simulation? That may want to be attached. if you don't have the portability, then it's going to stick to somebody like super glue in one experience, and it's going to bounce over their head in another. Okay, and it's not how the designer of that piece of jewelry designed it in the first place. So these experiences will change as we move around. Spawnables, skybox, things like that. So when I talk about this, the layout, here's an example of a web page, right? So on a web page, we have the layout that's all HTML, and we know where the top box is, we know where the title bar is, we know how to lay out the trails, the sides, the pieces. All of this is pretty much the instructions laid out on how we do this. 3D? Nah. Right? So the reality is if you look at this picture and it looks really strange, it is actually laid out similar, okay? Because we know where we can place the health bar, the UI portion of it here. We know where the spawnable is, where I can put the character in. We know how to place static objects in there. We know how to create the cables on the floor and lay this into the whole scene. We know how to place that small pillar. We know where the sphere is. We know where the backdrops and special effects should go. And we know where the lights are. However, I can't just go in Unity or O3D or Unreal and say, oh, just load it. That's not happening because Unity has their format. Unreal has their format. O3D has their format. Pick your favorite engine, has its own format. How do you plan on traversing any kind of semblance across this without even getting this part right? Just a scene builder. Now, there's things like USD. Pixar's got some great stuff in USD that can describe a scene. But it's made more for the authoring side. Like it can keep history and a lot of other things. So it's got to be super slim, super neat, concise, but be able to be flexible enough to place any kind of object within the scene. And so, are we really talking about VRML? Does anybody remember VRML? Right. So I'm not the oldest guy in the room. So VRML, I mean, think about it. That's what it was. It was placement, right, of where all the objects went, what we were doing. Are we just revisiting it? Are we reinventing it? Because we're going to need something. But the thing is that the experience has changed. VRML was kind of a web-based thing. But it'll differ when I'm on a mobile device, or whether I'm on a Steam Deck, or on a VR headset, or on a PC. So we've got to think a little bit bigger. And things are a little different than they were back then. With all the pieces I've been talking about, shaders and attributes and textures and all, that all plays along with it. So is it robust enough? Is it maybe something that USD can cover? Is there something else that's out there that we haven't really touched into that can cover most of what we need that we might be able to modify to get us there? Or are we just straight up starting over? And this is part of the argument that I want to pose for how we actually can get there. Because there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas, a lot of open source elements out there that are great, but are they the right thing? You know, is it enough of a foundation? So this is part of the argument I pose for scenes. Objects, relationships matter. My man, right? This guy has got it going on. But if you think about what is an avatar, and I started the basics of an avatar itself when I'm moving through experiences, this is my form of expression. This is not me, although it would be pretty cool. But this could be somebody's avatar, okay? And so when I go from one experience to another, I expect to look like that. You will know me because I look like that. You're not going to see the real me. But what is that? Well, he's got his accessories, right? He's got his jacket, his pants, his boots. He's got his ring on his finger, right? He's got the cool hair. He's got his axe, right? These are all separate objects that all have separate relationships. So when I go to put these clothes on him, they go in the right place. When he holds his axe, he doesn't hold it with his toe. You know, these are important. And so what the critical part is that when we're talking about, I might buy this guy or I might assemble him in a centralized environment. I go to Facebook and they sell all these pieces and I've got it, right? But now I have to lift them out of that and bring them into a decentralized area that's not company-based. And certain attributes, I need those to carry out as well. I need the relationships of where these things go to, where the anchor points are. What is it made of? What are the materials? What are the commonalities of it? Because when I go over there, unless I'm using Facebook's code, if I don't have a standard, it's not going to look like it. What you're going to get is that guy. Okay? That's what you're going to get. His hand's going to go at his head. You're not going to know what he looks like. And it's going to be all over the place. It'll be a hot mess. Not very viable for immersion, is it? Pretty good. I mean, that would be impressive, but But that's but that's why these things are, why these really matter, because it's not just the whole scene, it's the objects and how they relate to each other. And having those standards are a critical piece to it. That interoperability is what's going to allow commercial content to be viable. When Nike turns around and they want to sell you those sneakers, and you buy those sneakers, they belong on your feet. Okay, Nike's not going to be happy if everybody's wearing shoe hands. All right? They're going to want them to be on your feet. They're going to want to be in place correctly. They want to make sure that the product looks the way it's supposed to look, that it acts the way it's supposed to act, that it's representative of the intellectual property. And the licensed branding behind that is critical. That swoosh should better be there in the color for the brand, or Jordan better look like Jordan, not Urkel. So, these are really important because disruption of intellectual property and licensing is critical. And without consistency, you will have disruption. And content's king. Bottom line, Metaverse only flourishes with content. And then there's that user-generated content. When somebody creates that next meme, I mean, how many have seen TikTok videos and some kind of graphic or GIF or something that just all of a sudden millions of people have it and they want it and they love it? It gets distorted. What happens is that distorted image, because of it, winds up creating an alter ego or can negatively impact that brand. All of a sudden, that thing that was worth a lot is worth nothing, or has a negative connotation tied to it. So this is why consistency and standards are important even from this perspective. Animation, right? I bring a character in, they walk, they strut, they do different things, right? You have to know where the root motion node is. You got to know where is the first bone that I know what the height is off the ground, how they operate. Because if I get it wrong in the up axis, well, they get the up axis. See, up axis is when we bring one in, it says, okay, where that bone is located, what's up? Is it on the y-axis? Is it on the z-axis? Like where it is. If you get it wrong, which we do, we get this. We literally have it on the wrong axis, and you go to walk, and dude's spinning around in circles. Okay, not uncommon. Those who play in graphics know what this is. You see it all the time. You're like, oh, I gotta flip the z-axis. But without the consistency, if you at least had a standard that said this model was built z-axis up, then as an experience, I know I should flip that in software. I should do something about it, okay? And then the animation data behind that. You've got procedural data. Procedural data is where we have entire data blocks that have been built using AI or different models. And what they do is when I actually say turn, they create new animations. They literally alter the bone structure of these models and can make them go from a trot to a lean. And no artist was involved at all with any of it, okay? But if I don't have a standard that says, hey, I have procedural data that belongs to this character, then it's going to be clumping along. It's not going to work. Or maybe it was done with a shared data, with a morph target. So morph targets are really important because it's for deforming meshes. Facial expressions. So imagine if I don't have a standard to say, by the way, this animation object has a morph target table, okay? And that means it has facial expressions. If it's not there, you won't see facial expressions. It won't smile, it won't frown, it won't do anything. It'll just be stuck. So that means that the original person who wrote that, and you bought it, when you go to another experience, if there are no standards, it will not operate. Imagine the bicycle that you ride around that is great, and when you leave the store, the brakes are locked up permanently because you left the store. When people start putting hard money down, there is a reality to happen. Digital assets, people just take it for granted that they just magically work. Let me give you a hint. Digital assets have to actually operate just as much as real world goods. And they have to operate in the environments they need to be in. And then, of course, we have blended, which is the simpler of them all, which is just a matter of it going, hey, I know how to walk, I know how to run, I know how to stand, and it kind of goes, okay, I'll make an average between the two, and the faster you run, the faster I change the animation. Again, these are 3 different models that can be part of that character, that avatar that you bought that you wanted to be. Now let's talk about if you were a horse or a butterfly or pixie or whatever. They're all going to act differently. They're going to need, there's no one bullet fits all. The same animation table is not going to work. Could you imagine trying to get a human and a horse? Skeletal animation? Boy, that would be pretty ugly. So These are really important. Digital twin is really important here when we're talking about physical into digital, which we see already today. We're talking about large coordinate space, streaming tiles. They were already able to do this where I can take a real world and I can stream in the tiles and 3D geometry from what I've taken from different people who have scanned them and brought them in. And it's great, and they'll be just as much active. But when we start crossing that boundary of people in the real world interacting in a virtual world with a digital twin, the last thing you need is the person walking down the street sitting in the center of the road because the digital twin was wrong or the person's representative position was wrong. Okay? And this goes both ways. Even in the augmented landscape, think about it. When we start talking about interaction of what's going to be an augmented versus real, the digital world has to be just as accurate with real world. So when I go to place the phone to see what's being augmented in the space, that person doesn't wind up on top of the Empire State Building when they were just supposed to be next to by a door. So again, there's no standards that really exist for these things, but there need to be. And these are the things that we have to work with in open source and open collaboration. Code objects. I always tell people don't count the web out just yet. It's one thing it has been able to do good is be able to take small blocks of objects, especially code pieces, and we're really, really good at that. We can link a bunch of these things and throw a few URLs in there, and I can move code blocks around like it's no tomorrow. They're good at it. It's a great transitional element. One of the things I brought up this morning was that we have to look at this realistically, in stages. We're not just going to arrive at this new protocol, new server, new everything. We've got to start using what we have already. Web servers can do a lot of this stuff. It's great at it already. But the code blocks can be built for some of these 3D objects. Web GPU, WebAssembly. These are big pieces. I can take entire C++ blocks out of an engine, put it into WebAssembly. I can take the 3D renderers and put that into Web GPU and be able to take advantage of the power of mobile devices, tablets, PCs, browsers, all of this stuff. So we have kind of a transitional means to get there, because if you really think that somebody's going to download an application for each place that you go, you would probably find another profession. Because it's not realistic. I'm not going to hey, I'm just cruising around Facebook. Look, there's the Microsoft portal. Let me go over there. Oh, you must download this 600 gig file first. Let me run setup. That's not going to happen. Okay? So these are things that can help us get that portability and having that be able to work. That's part of one of the pieces behind the Open3D engine is because it's modular, some of those portability pieces. When you go to load an image, like the image we have up here, a couple of those, you don't really think Microsoft rewrote the entire JPEG library from scratch just for Microsoft Office, do you? No, they went and grabbed live JPEG off the open source, out of the open source world, and they use that because it works. Same thing has to happen for the 3D space. We need a handful of table stakes, common things that we know will operate that can be usable in different environments. It's not going to be all open source. It's going to be commercial and open source. But the more we have them working together, the better off it is. And that's the point I was making here. The reusable libraries allow us to create consistency. They won't have to re-download an app for each thing. Now it's just incremental. If I go to the Unreal site, right, I may not be able to see these massive landscapes elsewhere, but when I come into the Unreal site, guess what? I pull down Nanite. Wow, look at this. I got this amazing technologies. That means that companies can still bring down their modules with the common shared libraries to differentiate themselves for their technological advances. That allows incumbents to grow and build new technologies. It allows companies to keep reinventing themselves so we don't just wind up with an AOL platform. And then, of course, like I said, it accelerates innovation, and open source support is an essential for these common libraries. And then I talked about this earlier with scripting and the abilities tied to kind of objects and screens and how they interact. So thoughtful content decisions. If anybody's actually, I'm sure everybody's used Netflix, right? You ever pull it up in the first time and it gets kind of blocky and it's kind of chunky for a little bit, and then it's like, oh yeah, the video looks beautiful now. I'll give you a hint. It's been encoded like in 8 or 10 different bit rates. Okay? One for your phone, one for slow internet, one for fast internet, one for high definition. And it changes automatically between them. Guess what? When I have to pull down 400 megs worth of textures and 3D data, I can do the same thing. They're called LODs. If I pull down a 4K image, that 4K image is going to be a few megs. But I can pull down, say, a 128 LOD. It's going to look a little chunky, but it's going to weigh in at like 30K, right? So we have the ability of treating some of the early images at a lower LOD and then increasing the fidelity as the bandwidth allows to bring them in, to bring them up to speed. And then having those defined relationships. It's important to have those relationships because I need to know, I'm not just going to pull the whole scene down. I'm going to pull down what I see first. Those relationships will tell me what I should pull down in what order. I'm looking at the ground or the grass, and the grass should appear becoming beautiful first before I look at the street sign behind me that I don't actually see. And the relationships will tell me what I need to go pull down and what I need to do. And I do it just like I do the browser today. You fire up that web page, guess what? One thread opens up for the page and 20 more pop up behind it to pull all the images in the same time. It's not going sequentially, it pulls them all in parallel. That's why your page loads the way it does. Platform available content, being able to have some precompiled things that will, when it identifies as a mobile phone or identifies as a PC, that we pull down some of the precompiled textures that are already there, readily usable by those platforms, instead of trying to burn a hole on the device, trying to convert them for you on the fly. And then, of course, having a default level of physics and generated colliders, just some default things that are there in case they're not provided. At least I can say the default collider for a table is a table. Okay, I'm good with that. But nothing is way worse. And allow the experience and the platforms to make the right choices. This is not about telling you how you should build your back end or how you should build your experience. It's about building the standards so that you can make the decisions on what you can do. If you want to support mobile, as long as the standard has you the ability for you to read a JSON file and say it has this, 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 and this, then I can optimize that experience for any content, whether it was designed for me or not. But getting no information is way worse. Create formats, I was talking about this earlier about things like USD. A lot of authoring tools have great stuff with amazing features, but they can bloat out the bandwidth in the CPU. And so you want to be able to have these things where they're separated in pieces with relationships. Helping define these formats to be network and processor optimal at runtime is critical. You can't expect you pull down that game, it's 40, 50 gigs, right? And you're like, man, that's a big game. What you don't realize is that game was about 700 gigs in source material to build it. And I'm being generous, by the way. So this is a critical piece, having them to be network and processing time optimal. Using the right tools for commercial and open source, the different engines to get this done. And having cloud tools, like say AWS has Nimble Studios or Omniverse, where people can start building them. I mean, do you think that web pages are easy, right? I build a web page, I update it, poof, it's changed, right? All right, so what if when you want to change the metaverse? What if you want to change your experience, right? You've got to have hot loading of assets and mergeable updates, or breaking news, we'll be performing scheduled maintenance on my metaverse experience, and it'll be down for 1 hour. Are you kidding me? Could you imagine shutting your website down where everybody, millions of people go per minute because you need to update the content, right? These standards are what will open up the ability of hot loading assets and being able to do mergeable updates while people are using it. And people aren't even thinking about this, but this is real. So, the create formats have the amazing features, like I said before, and the redefinition. So I just kind of repeated and to reemphasize that. So what are the steps? Anybody remember WAP? WAP? Yeah, we got somebody. Do you remember 2G phones? Remember the phones before we had a real browser? And they could pull down kind of the web pages, right? That's because they fed them into WAP, which were micro browsers, and they converted the images and they converted the page to a smaller version so you can get them down in 2G. How could that work today? Well, you can also be using cloud services to do dynamic conversion, LODs. So I might have an experience, but if everybody makes giant images, I could proxy them in the same type of environment so that they get a great experience. Until we get to the point where 5G is everywhere and bandwidth is trivial and who cares? But we dealt with this in the past. A lot of things I'm talking about we've dealt with before. So we're talking about cloud services that can do that. Astro distribution is heavy, heavy lifting. Think about it. You're talking about putting 3D objects, textures. I mean, a single object with a handful of textures. Your image that you see on Facebook's like maybe, I don't know, half meg, a meg if it's really shiny, right? Let me give you a 3D object. After 6 different textures and the mesh itself, you could be weighing in at 30 megs on that thing. Okay, that's just reality. So does that mean that we should be looking at things like IPFS, interplanetary file system, right, as distribution miles? Things that we can actually incentivize the network of users to actually help build the network instead of being billed by the network. So there are things of that nature. Then you also have things maybe like Filecoin. Maybe that's another option. Or something else new. But in this model here, when we're talking about distribution of these assets, you've got to incentivize the network to grow and to allow people to actually reuse their bandwidth and become part of the solution and not the problem. Because the magnitude of data from web to 3D is probably about 40-fold larger across the board. And I'm being a bit generous with that too. Especially when people want to start adding like fancy shaders and effects and all this other cool stuff, it all goes out the window. So open standards, we're not going to get it right the first time. It's an iterative process. We have to do this step by step by step, and it's going to be driven by demand and innovation. The work on the open standards will get us today from where we're at to generation 1, 2, 3, 4. That progress will drive people, just the way it did when we all started out with Netscape. Okay? Hierarchies, remote modules, keep it simple. Make it human readable. We don't really need this incredible binary flat format, out of hell. Don't over-engineer it. Let's actually make something that people can easily modify and add to, and it's adaptable. That can be battle tested with tools that we know exist today. Most importantly, let's get an argument started. I would love to have people just throwing things at me going, no, that's not viable, that's not real. Tell me what you think's not real. Tell me what you think is viable. Everybody comes from a different market, a different industry. But this has an impact across the board. There's not a part of the market that I haven't touched in this entire conversation that was tied to 3D. Talked about IP, talked about money, talked about brand, distribution. All that good stuff came along with it. Identity. We have the birds of a feather discussion open tomorrow. Think about it tonight. And then come tomorrow and argue it. Argue it from a mobile perspective. Argue it from a PC perspective. Argue it from a brand perspective. Bring the arguments of what we do, because this is the only way it's going to happen. Open source and open standards are an essential part of this equation. And that's why we're bringing here to accelerate the conversation, because you as the community are the only way it's going to happen. Thank you.